So we've already been fishing on the mighty River Severn. Now it's time to switch focus slightly and meet one of the Severn's lesser known tributaries, the River Stour. This small stream begins life around the Clent Hills, flows through the heart of the industrial Midlands before heading towards Stourport where it meets the Severn. When I was a lad, the Stour was so badly polluted that it contained no life, and my parents told me to stay away from it, which of course I didn't. And it wasn't until the 80s that it began to make a recovery. It's an intimate river and the banks are wild for most of its length, and of course it does contain fish. Chub thrive in neglected, overgrown rivers, and they are probably the Stour's dominant species. Rivers like the Stour are great places to cut your teeth in chub fishing, and one of the most important lessons to learn is stealth.
The thing about chub fishing is that you want to keep as quiet as you can, so don't stand up high on the bank. You need to keep yourself low profile and just creep into position.
Chub can be found in many places in the river, but they love cover. Find an overhanging tree or other type of snag and the chances are that you've found chub. I like to use white bread for chub with either bread crust or flake on the hook and some liquidised bread as an attractor.
Well, I've already mentioned that chub can be relatively easy to catch, and one of the reasons for that is that they'll take all manner of baits, and sometimes the simplest and the easiest to get baits are the very best, and they don't come much more easy or cheap even than this bread. Chub absolutely love it. Now, I've got two types of bread here. I've got the bread that I'm putting on the hook, which in this case can either be slices out of a regular sliced loaf or the inside of a nice crusty loaf. We call this bread flake, this type of bait, and it's pinched around the shank of the hook. Very, very attractive to the fish because, of course, it's slightly buoyant, so it wafts around off the bottom, and the fish love it. But to attract the fish into the swim, it's bread again, but this is a sliced loaf that's been put through a food blender to smash it up into tiny little bread particles. And if I do this, just one squeeze, it'll hold together long enough for you to flick them in the water, and then as the bread hits the water, it breaks into thousands of little fragments that shatter and work their way down into the current, down the river, and it will attract chub to where your hook bait is. So bread is absolutely brilliant for chub. It's probably the number one bait in my eyes.
My chub fishing routine on streams and small rivers is to walk the banks and to feed a couple of handfuls of liquidised bread into likely looking swims. Pre-baiting swims works really well, and I'll often move around between several swims, fishing, baiting and resting to keep the fish coming. Simple ledger tactics work perfectly well for chub. A quiver tip's a good idea though, not because chub are especially shy, but because the softer nature of the quiver tip will provide amplification of the bite and offer less resistance to a taking fish. Bread doesn't just only catch chub. It's also a fine bait for roach, dace and bream. Occasionally it produces a real surprise. In this case I found myself fishing off a difficult high bank. The flow in the swim was gentle, but there were snags present. Within a couple of minutes of casting in, the tip began to twitch, but the bite lacked the ferocity of a chub. I suspected something else and struck just in time. At first sight, I was convinced that I'd hooked one of the Stour's rare specimen roach, but it wasn't to be. The fish was in fact a hybrid, a cross between bream and roach. Hybrids are quite common in some lakes and rivers, but not on the Stour.
If you're thinking that this fish looks a little bit like a juvenile bream, a little bit like a roach, you'd be absolutely right, because as far as I can tell, this is what we call a roach-bream hybrid, and the two species have spawned together to produce this hybrid fish. It's a really nice fish, put up a nice fight, and it really nailed that piece of bread big time.
Fishing pre-baited swims often yields good results, and a short afternoon session can yield several fish. To be sure, the chub in the Stour can't compare in size to the giants of typical southern streams, but catching fine, healthy looking chub in spanking condition is not to be sniffed at anywhere. And catching them from a stream that was once so polluted that it contained no fish is a real thrill. Fishing the Stour takes me back to the days of my youth, where I learned to fish in the heart of the industrial Midlands. being able to slip from a world of urban chaos to the peace and quiet of the riverbank in the blink of an eye has always thrilled me.
They're chunky old fish and they'll eat just the simplest of baits. This one had a great big lump of bread flake on a size 8 hook.
There's a joy in sitting by a small stream with a rod in the heart of urban surroundings that's always thrilled me, and that's why I continue to fish the Stour to this day. Our next tale concerns catching fish in the unlikeliest of conditions, when the river's raging and bank high. In the past few years, flooding's become an increasing risk in the Severn Valley. Every Severn regular knows that the river can be unfishable for several weeks or even months in the period between autumn and the end of the coarse fishing season in mid-March. Indeed, it's not unusual to rock up to the river only to find that the level is several metres above the normal height of summer. Learning to cope with floods is a challenge that defeats many anglers, but it's not as impossible as you might think. I've caught fish when the river's literally bursting its banks, and the side streams and feeder rivers are pumping in millions of gallons of churning water. Floodwater fishing isn't for the faint-hearted, but there is hope. Thankfully, some species of fish thrive in heavy, dirty water, and one of those species is barbel. Barbel use the small, fleshy appendages known as whiskers to detect food in water that's too coloured to offer any visibility. Conditions that most other species don't enjoy are relished by old whiskers. So let's start with arguably the worst conditions, when the river's in full flood, bank high and filthy. Finding a swim that has the right current and flow is vital. You should look for water that's flowing steadily at a walking pace. Avoid swims that backflow or have conflicting flows and look for smooth glides. You'll find them most frequently on the Severn if you concentrate on swims with bushes or trees that stick out into the river and put a brake on the flow. To catch barbel in a flood, you rarely need to fish far out. If the rig that you're using thumps down on the deck after casting out, you're in the right place. And remember that some of the best floodwater swims might not hold fish when the river's at normal level. Indeed, some of my favourite floodwater hotspots are dry under normal conditions. You'll need to use a lead that's comfortably heavy enough to hold bottom in the area that you're fishing. Bait-wise, anything with a good scent is what you want. Top of my list is a big chunk of luncheon meat fished on a big hook. The scent of the meat will draw barbel to it and help them to find the bait when visibility is at a minimum. In a flood, I like to touch ledger. It's not that the bites are shy, but by crooking the line over my finger, I can feel as well as see the difference between debris hitting the line and a real bite. On this day, with the river still rising and colouring, typically when it came, the bite was such a surprise that I almost missed the fish, and my coffee cup almost ended up in the river. No matter, it was barbel on.
just goes to prove that in these absolutely hopeless flooded conditions with the river bursting its banks, that if you know where to fish and you're prepared to persevere, then you can catch a barbel in even the most dire circumstances.
I've already stated that the timing of your visit to the river in flood conditions can make a huge difference to results. Here's the Duke about to prove the point when, on this visit to the Severn, he got his timing absolutely right. It's autumn, the river's been in flood and now it's falling rapidly, with the colour dropping out. Better water clarity made fishing with pellets a better option than using the meat, which tends to be top choice in heavily coloured water. Such conditions also bring chub into play as well as barbel. Chub are less keen on chocolate coloured water, it seems, than their whiskered cousins. First fish of the day, however, is a barbel, and a cracking fish it turned out to be. As is often the way, a fish hooked had the effect of putting the other residents down for a while, and it took a while for the next bite to develop. This time around though, it is a chub that takes the bait. As time ticked by, the swim remained quiet, but as every true angler knows, the witching hour, when the light begins to fade, is often the best time of day to produce a bite. And so it proved. As the bats and owls began to stir, so did the rod tip. One of the species of fish that I associate with the years of my youth spent fishing on the Severn is eels. The European eel, its Latin name is Anguilla anguilla. And while much of the eel's life, especially its early life, remains a mystery, it is known that they breed many thousands of miles away in the Sargasso Sea and then drift. They form at this stage more like translucent flatfishes than eels, for 300 days or more on the oceanic currents until they reach the European coast, whereupon they become tiny, transparent replicas of the adult glass eels. Eels drift around the coast seeking fresh water, and as they begin to enter the estuaries, they undergo another metamorphosis, developing yellow silver bellies and darker backs, whereupon they're referred to as elvers. My encounter with the Elver Men of the lower Severn, traditional net fishers with territorial rights, took place one fine spring evening a few years ago. I was a little nervous, having heard all sorts of rumours about the so-called Elver Mafia. And yet 3 nicer blokes than Elver Dave, Andrew and Bill could I wish to have met. I discovered that the first part of a successful night's elvering starts with burgers cooked over an open fire.
The vocabulary of the Elver Men. The spot where we fish, you would call that your tump. So that's where your fishing spot is called a tump.
Then you got things like swimming, whether the fish are swimming, whether they're sagging back, so they got a bit tired and they're coming back with the tide and you catch them. So that's sagging. You got somebody asked what you get in a shut. A shut is where you're tipping into your bucket. What's the other one then?
Somebody asks you what you're catching, you lie through your teeth. It's called bullshit.
So, I had learned that elver fishing takes place from a spot called a tump. I watched as Dave and the lads submerged their nets into the water, facing the current, and waited. Every few minutes or so, they would complete the shut by taking the net out and depositing the elvers into a bucket.
Best time for elvering here, you follow the tides and listen to where the fish are being caught, and as they slowly move up the river, we can predict roughly when they'll be here within a couple of days. So if they were caught at Maysmore 2 nights ago, then we'd expect them to be here tonight or tomorrow night.
You've got to, when you start catching, you've got to look after them. You've got to get them in trays, get them settled down, pour plenty of water over them. You don't keep them in water, they go in a mesh tray so the water drains through them. If you leave them in too much water, then obviously they use all the oxygen and drain. So you keep them in trays, like Andy said. One of us go on fishing, the other one will be up, traying up, keep on pouring water through. And like I say, a magical night is getting 30-40 kilos.
The lads were having a decent night, and soon they began to transfer them onto trays. Many of the elvers were destined for a station in nearby Tewkesbury, manned by the Sustainable Eel Group chairman, Andrew Kerr.
We formed the Sustainable Eel Group to take action on behalf of the eel. The sort of things we've been doing have been to unblock the migratory pathways, and in the last 2 years, working with the Rivers Trust and the Environment Agency, over 600 solutions have now been implemented. We've still got tens of thousands to go, but it's a great start. Then we've been working with the fishermen themselves and the industry themselves to form a sustainable supply chain so that the consumer can buy eel and enjoy eating it, knowing that it's come from a sustainable source. And then the third thing we've been doing is we've been catching fish, and last year the fishermen gave over 1 million eels and then relocating them above the barriers.
The eels we delivered were earmarked to be transported and released into the streams, ditches and waterways of the UK. As the night wore on, tumps yielded dwindling returns, and before I knew it, my magical night with the Elver Men was over.
Whereas now there's a little bit of money to be made, but it's fun. It's such good fun. Once you're into it, once you've been, it's in your blood. I mean, who in their right mind is going to stand on the bank of the River Severn, pouring with rain, to catch baby eels?
In my book, a perfect fishing trip starts with a fry up on the bank. It's a cold winter day, and the sausages and bacon went down a treat before we made our way along the riverbank to fish for barbel. On the way downstream, we discussed our chances of contacting old Whiskers, and in the event, things turned out pretty well, though not quite the way we expected. With Mick being the guest on my home stretch at Hampton Load, I decided to put him in the swim that I felt might offer him the best shot. A cracking spot, sandwiched between two bushes, with deep water on the inside. So convinced was I that he would get a bite, that rather than fish myself, I grabbed my flask and sat down next to the Duke while he fished out the first couple of casts. It didn't take long. Within a couple of minutes of casting in, Mick's rod buckled over and he was into a fish.
That's right, got him. Yeah, hold on to him hard, mate.
That one's on.
I told you you'd get one here. You're going to have to keep him out of that stuff.
I'm doing my best, mate. I still feel the breath, no sense.
I wouldn't mind him going out in the current. It's if he gets into these.
Yeah, well, he's midway between the bushes at the moment. I still feel the breath, no sense. You've got a chance.
Here he comes. Oh, it's a nice one.
You've got a
Oh,
chance.
it's just slipping away, Mick. Yes, well done, well done. Oh, I've had that 2 minutes fishing.
Well,
That's it, you got the hook.
yeah. Well, that was nice, wasn't it?
Yeah. I'll get your rod out of the way, mate. You have a look at your
thanks.
fish.
Perhaps you could put some bait in the other swim.
Yeah, I'll do that.
It's quite chilly. The river's roaring through with flood water, and I've got one. And believe me, if there was ever a fish that was capable of finding your bait in these conditions, it's the barbel. It's perfectly designed for that sort of feeding. So I'm going to get this one back and go and have a word with Matt, and I know he's being greedy, but I'd love to catch another one.
So the first fish of the day was a barbel. What a start. With an early fish under our belts, we sat a while longer in Mick's swim, but it wasn't until we made a short move downriver that we got the next action. Sitting next to each other in a double swim with plenty of room for two anglers, we sat drinking tea and chatting. My approach was to touch ledger so that I could feel as well as see any bites. However, on this occasion, I found myself playing a fish when I lifted the rod to wind in without any indication of a bite whatsoever. A short time later, I had a reminder of why catching eels has never been top of my list.
You're never going to guess what this is.
Chub.
It's not a chub. It's something I don't like catching and you do.
It's an eel.
Yeah, I know. I can't believe it. You love eels.
I love them, yeah. I love them.
And I can't stand catching them, but I'm glad you're here actually. You can deal with this. Oh, look at it. Go on, you buffoon. Get it in.
It's in. It's in. Well, at one time we used to take eels to eat them, but they're quite scarce nowadays. There's nowhere near as many eels in the river as there used to be, and I suppose it's man's fault for taking them for eating. But well, this one in a few years' time, hopefully it'll get back to the Sargasso Sea and breed and send some of its babies back across to repopulate the river.
So I'd caught an eel, much to the Duke's delight. Me, I just wanted to hook a barbel, and we moved swims again in an attempt to end the session on a high. It took a while before either of us got another touch. Shortly before dark, Mick found himself playing a big fish, a barbel certainly, but it was not a tail with a happy ending, with the fish becoming snagged within a few seconds of the hookup. Despite trying every trick that we knew to free it, the fish remained solid, and in the end we became convinced that it had dumped the rig in a snag and was long gone. We fished on, of course, but as the evening progressed the air temperature dropped and the feeding spell was over. We sat under twilight skies, willing the rod tip to move again, but it didn't. There will be other days though, with new adventures to look forward to. That's fishing sometimes, and this one had been memorable for all the wrong reasons.